Hello guys, let's start our second lecture. Okay, I'm gonna check a couple of things here to make sure it is working well. All right. So, why the Manchus matter? This will be our first lecture of the Qing period of modern China. And you've read about the basic information about the founding of the Qing dynasty and its rule over China for about 260 years. I'm going to highlight several key points and bring in some key concepts for understanding the Qing rule much further and connecting it to why it matters to the continuous modern Chinese history. So 3 main questions we're going to address for this class. First of all, who are the Manchus and why did they matter to the formation of a Chinese identity? Second of all, we know that the Manchus were originally an ethnic minority from the northeast part of China. How did it manage to not only conquer China, the vast Chinese proper, but also rule over the Han majority, which was about 100 of times the population of the Manchus. And third of all, during the Qing dynasty, China reached its current, actually larger than the current geographic extent. So how did the Manchus manage to conquer and more importantly, to keep so much territory under control? Now, the first question. The Manchus, as we said, is a group of people traditionally resided in the northeastern part of current China, right? What you now consider the Chinese map, the northeastern part of it. Now we also call that part Manchuria, consisting of 3 provinces. They were considered one of the northern nomads in pre-modern categories that the Chinese use. The Chinese always draw a line between the nomads people and the agricultural people meeting themselves, and they held the belief dearly that the Chinese were much more civilized than the nomads to the north. So the Manchus, like other nomads, such as the Mongols and the some Turkish groups in the northwestern part of China, are very good hunters, good horseback riders and warriors, which partly explain their military success in the conquest of China that you can read about. Okay, so in which category do we understand them? For a long time, the Manchus were considered as an ethnic group, although Chinese back then may not use such term. And now they are officially categorized as an ethnic group by the People's Republic of China. It's recognized as one of the 56 ethnic groups in contemporary China. But once in a moment in history, it was considered a race. So that's why I want to bring in the concepts of race and ethnicity and talk about their differences. I'm going to give you several seconds to think about the differences yourself. I'm sure you all realize some differences. What is your race and what is your ethnicity? Okay, it probably all occurred to you that race is biologically decided. In a way, you can't really change that. And ethnicity is more pertaining to one's language, culture, customs, one's habits, key festivals, right? Sometimes cuisine is an important marker of one's ethnicity. Okay. By that token, ethnicity can be a question of choice, whereas race cannot. For example, you can become Jewish by having an induction ceremony of some sort and by adopting the important Jewish rituals and ceremonies and festivals. While we know that the first daughter, Ivanka Trump, actually became Jewish in order to marry Jared Kushner, a main Jewish family, prominent Jewish family based in New York. So you can become a certain ethnic group. Some ethnic groups may not allow you to join, but some do. Whereas you can't really say, well, I want to become a member of that race. You don't have that choice, right? You either are or are not a member of that race. Okay. And there are many more ethnicities than races. You can probably only have one race unless you are biracial, right? Usually people are either white or black, or half black, half white, or Asian. And there's a category, the Pacific Islanders as well, but there are only so many racial choices. But when it comes to ethnicity, there are multiple, each demanding a certain culture, tradition, or legacy. For example, and you can be more than one ethnicity. For example, you can identify ethnically as Irish and Polish, in that matter. Okay, so like we said before, ethnicity, the ethnic line is kind of more easier to transpass or change because it is based on culture, and cultural rituals or habits can be adopted. You can learn a language and you can learn customs in order to fit an ethnic group. There are certain things you can learn to or adopt to become a certain race, right? So the line between the Chinese and, say, the Manchus or Mongols or other nomads for that matter in the past is not a hard line to cross. The Chinese are very proud of their culture, and they discriminate against people from other culture, especially nomadic people, but they also welcome and take for granted that other people should learn from them. So once other people adopt the Chinese clothes or the Chinese habits, and they become a member of the agriculture society, adopt Chinese names, and learn the Chinese language, slowly, in a matter of several generations, Chinese will take those people as Chinese as well. One interesting example is that not many outsiders know about this, but in my hometown, there's a city not far from where I am now, about 15 miles away maybe, named Kaifeng. Kaifeng, right? If you're interested, you can research into the Kaifeng Jews. So during the Song Dynasty, around the turn of 1000 AD, there was a group of Jewish people migrated to China all the way from the Middle East, not from Europe. And they not only settled down in China, but also married the Chinese and in a way became the Chinese. They were very well assimilated into the Chinese society. Many of them, the Jewish also have a tradition of emphasizing on their education. So many Jewish people actually even took the civil service examination. Now you all know what that is. So they took the civil service examination and even became Chinese officials. And this is a very good example to show that how you can actually become Chinese even if you're from a different race, not to mention that if you're from a different ethnicity. Okay, but I want to add something very important about race. We have just said that race is biologically decided, yes, but you may have a sense that I feel like there is something social about race as well. And you're absolutely right. Whereas racial differences are biologically decided, racial hierarchy, which race is considered superior and which race is considered inferior, those type of ideas is often socially imposed. Okay, so racial categories have had a much more concrete impact on people's lives, especially in the United States, if you look at the history of this country. Because racial categories which people came up have been used to discriminate against certain groups and to distribute resources unequally, which is the ultimate purpose of racial discrimination, right? So there's something biological and something social about race. Now coming back to applying the ethnic categories to the Chinese, okay. So we've talked about the idea of a Han, H-A-N, the Han ethnic group. I'm a member of the Han group. And the Han people accounted for more than 90% of the current Chinese population. Han is obviously an ethnicity. There is no distinctive physical differences between the Han and the Manchus. And it had been an ethnic idea before China's encounter with the West. In other words, race was a concept imported from the West. Before the time of the Opium War and before China's encounter with Western imperialism, Chinese did not think in racial terms because they've been only encountered with people who were very similar to them, and they didn't think there's any essential differences between themselves and other people, although there were stereotypes and discrimination. Okay. Like we said before, the difference between the Chinese and non-Chinese before the Westerners came in lay in culture, language, customs, diet, and clothing. So it was only after the idea of race was imported from the West that the Chinese started to think in such terms and started to apply such terms. Okay. We are going to talk about this again, but for a short period of time in the context of the anti-Qing revolution. Okay. So around late 19th century, there have been waves of revolution led by the Han Chinese to overthrow the Manchu rule. And they applied the racial categories they just learned from the West to describe the differences between the Manchus and the Chinese. They were saying, look, we have been ruled by an alien race, and we have been oppressed by an alien race. If China or the Chinese or the Han Chinese wanted to get back on its foot and fight back the Westerners, we must first of all overthrow the alien race over us, and that is the Manchus. So for a time of about 50 years or so, the Manchus in the anti-Qing context was recognized as a race. But once the Qing dynasty was overthrown and the Republic of China was founded, the Manchus were immediately categorized as ethnicity. Why? Because only when it is an ethnicity, you can say it is an ethnic group which also make up the Chinese race. Right now, the Chinese are saying the Chinese race consists of multiple ethnic groups, including the Han, of course, but also including the Mongols and the Manchus, because only in this way can they claim the territories once brought by the Manchus under the Chinese map. Okay. Because the Chinese empires, the Han-based empires in the past used to be quite small. It definitely didn't reach the current geographic extent of China. Now you're looking at a map of the Ming Dynasty. Ming was the one that was conquered by the Manchu Qing Dynasty, right? But we all know that during the Qing, China became, or the Manchu Qing, China became very big. It absorbed territories from Mongolia, Manchuria, Xinjiang, Tibet, and much more on the southwestern part of it. So in order to claim that the Republic of China now inherits all the territory from the Qing, you have to say the Chinese include all the ethnic groups of the Qing, including the Manchus. Okay, so the racial part of the story identifying the Qing as a different race happened much later. But I want to tell you now that you will be reminded later on when we talk about that anti-Qing period. But for a long time under the Qing rule, during the Qing dynasty, the Manchus, of course, there was no concept of race, and people differentiate themselves still from customs, clothing, hairstyle, and all that. In your textbook, you read about how the Qing, the Manchu rulers really emphasized on maintaining their own ethnic identity, right? And I think the reason is it is easy for you to understand because theirs is a minority group in China surrounded by the Chinese, and the Chinese culture have been much more mature than the Manchu one. And the Chinese culture has a fame of slowly influencing other cultures and making them Chinese. So in order not to be absorbed or assimilated by the Chinese, their subjects, the Manchus really take care to maintain their ethnic identity by keeping their horse riding habits, by sending their young boys to Inner Mongolia for martial training, by maintaining their Manchu names. They even developed their own language, their script. Before the Manchu conquest of whole China and the founding of the Qing dynasty, the Manchus had a spoken language that the Chinese wouldn't be able to understand, but they didn't have a written language, right? So in order to really differentiate themselves from the Chinese and not to be looked down upon by the Chinese, the Manchus developed their own written language. One of the many things they did to maintain their ethnic identity. Not only that, the Manchu ruler, especially the early ones who just came to occupy China, almost immediately issued an edict to force all the Chinese to shave their heads and adopt the Manchu hairstyle. From this image, you can see the different hairstyle of the Ming official or a Ming scholar from a Manchu warrior, right? On the left is a image of a Manchu royal woman, so you can ignore that for now. And look at the right, the image on the right. You can see a Ming official with this special hat with the knot on the left, and an evolution, 3 images showing the evolution of the Manchu hairstyle on the right. So originally on the top, you have a person almost had his head fully shaved, except for a little bit of hair that's made into a braid. So that was a typical Manchu hairstyle when they just entered China proper and started to rule China. And later on, people grew their hair and hairstyle changed a little bit, but it still is a very distinctive hairstyle and was later called by the Europeans as a pigtail in a pejoratory sense. So you can imagine there was much backlash when the Manchus forced all the Chinese to adopt their hairstyle because the Chinese thought that their hairstyle, showed by the gentleman on the left, looks much more sophisticated than the barbaric Manchu hairstyle. But the edict was very hard, and it has a slogan: keep your hair and lose your head, or you can change your hair and keep your head. So basically, if you rebel against this edict, this head shaving edict, you have to pay with your own life. Now let's think about why the Manchus take pains and risk making many more Chinese to hate them to insist on imposing their own hairstyle on the Chinese. I'm gonna give you a minute to think about that. Why? Why do that? Is it just a symbolic matter, or it has some real functions? Okay, we can talk about that in the discussion next week. So to come back to this first question, right? Who were the Manchus and how they matter to the formation of a Chinese identity. We now know who the Manchus are and how they had been categorized in Chinese history in the past 100 years. Now, why did they matter to the Chinese identity? Chinese identity was built based on a Han ethnic identity, which was formed and was articulated during the Manchu rule in China for 260 years, especially in the Mingqing transition and in the later context of the anti-Manchu revolution. You see much articulation of how the Han is really different from the Manchu and how the Chinese is different from the Manchu. So you can say that the first step for the formation of Chinese nationalism took place during the Manchu Qing rule over China. And also we have said that the Republic of China and now the People's Republic of China, founded in 1949, inherited the territory and ethnic composition from the Qing dynasty, right? And because the Chinese empires before the Qing was much smaller and more homogeneous. So only after the Qing founded its rule in China, China became a multi-ethnic empire as it is right now. Okay. Now, let's move on to the second question. How did the Manchus maintain its rule over the Han majority? A big challenge after all. I would like to introduce the idea of the Mandate of Heaven first, whether or not you have heard of it. But it's a very important political philosophy in China, and it is at the core for any government to claim its political legitimacy. The idea of Mandate of Heaven was formed very early in Chinese history in the Zhou dynasty, which was about 500 to 600 BCE. You don't have to remember that. And Confucius was the one who fully developed and articulated the Mandate of Heaven idea to consolidate the idea among the minds of the Chinese educated class. It is important in understanding how any government in China in the past and present can maintain its rule solidly in China among the people. So the Mandate of Heaven holds that a certain family or a certain individual receives a mandate from the heaven to rule, which means that you don't have to be born in a certain family to inherit that right to rule. You get that right from the heaven. If the heaven is happy with your rule, you can continue to be the ruler. But if the heaven thinks that you're immoral or corrupt and no longer qualified to be the ruler, anyone could overthrow you and replace you. That is the idea. Now, several questions come to mind. How is it significant and different from other countries or civilizations that had an imperial family? Okay, for example, the difference from traditional China and from Japan. Japan had a royal family, and always that royal family, according to Japanese historians, the Japanese imperial family had ruled over Japan for over 2,600 years, and the imperial lineage had never been broken. No one would even challenge the rule of the Japanese imperial family, although pretty much all over throughout history, and the Japanese emperor or empress had been a figurehead, right? But the imperial family is supposed to be eternal and descendant from the sun goddess, and no one could replace it. Whereas in Chinese history, there had been more than a dozen of dynasties, each founded by a different family. Once one family's rule is no longer stable, and people think this family is no longer fit to rule, anyone can rebel against them and replace their rule. So that is the key difference. There's no royal family taken for granted in China. You fight for your royal status. And in a way, people are given a chance to become royalty. Now the second question, how do you know if the heaven is happy or upset with your rule? This philosophy holds that the heaven will give out signs. Okay, so if a ruler is proven to be a good ruler, there will be good signs. Harvest, certain auspicious beasts will appear on the one corner of the empire, certain auspicious flowers. Anyway, there will be auspicious signs, and people will pick up these signs and further prove the legitimacy of the government. But if there are natural disasters happening, floods, famine, drought, those are the first signs that the heaven is now upset with the ruler and you better fix it. That's one of the reasons why disaster relief had always been very important for a certain government's legitimacy in the past and even at present as well. So the Chinese dynasties in the past had put a lot of money and energy building dams, controlling drought, and send reliefs to famine refugees and all that, because they know that if they don't fix it, certain people will use this as an excuse to replace its own rule. And that's also why the current Chinese government puts a lot of emphasis on disaster relief. You should know that the main army in China, People's Liberation Army, is really famous for cracking down the Tiananmen Square demonstration and all that. And whenever there is a major war between China and other countries, the PLA would be the defense force for China. But China hadn't fought a war for a long time. And during peace times, one of the most important duties of the People's Liberation Army is to help with people who suffer from disaster. They would go to these areas where there's a flood and even form a human wall to block the human dam to block the water and all that, right? They're always at the center first time immediately after a disaster such as an earthquake hit a certain region. Okay, so mandate of heaven and idea of political legitimacy. Why is this important for now? It shows that the Chinese are not totally resistant to an alien ethnic group's rule. There's wiggle room. As long as you prove yourself to be a fit ruler, even if you're Manchus, who we originally think you're barbaric, uncivilized, all that, if you prove you have the ability to learn, to adopt the Chinese ways, and to have benevolence over the people, you can be the ruler over China, right? So this is an essential reason in terms of people's mindset why the Manchu rule over China can be acceptable. I don't know if this is analogy or comparison, contrast is totally appropriate, but I think, for example, in a Christian country in West Europe, people would be fundamentally against being ruled by, say, a Muslim nation or group, right? Because there is some fundamental unacceptability about that rule. Whereas in China, mandate of heaven set the room, leaves the room for alien rulers as long as they prove to be good rulers. And the Manchus quickly learned about the idea of mandate of heaven, and they did all the things that previous Chinese rulers did to prove they have the mandate of heaven. They, manufactured certain auspicious signs to show that there's a chosen ruler. They were very good with famine relief, especially in the first 100 years of their rule. They did everything that a benevolent ruler in the past in China was supposed to do. So they proved that they had the mandate of heaven.